Good morning. My name is Ginny Felice. I am the chair of the health education series that we have on Fab Fridays, and am wanting to tell you about a couple of upcoming Fab Fridays that you might be interested in joining in on. Catherine does announce them in the Sunday newsletter, but you might want to put these on your calendar. Then I'll introduce Dr. David Mao, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Coming up in the future on October 29th, Dr. Tim Gillespie, who is a dentist and I believe surgeon, I'm not positive, but is going to talk about the effect of oral health and the effect of oral health on our overall health. Then on November 12th, from the Health Education Series Committee, our Karen Sanders, who many of you know, is going to talk about how to best advocate for yourself if you end up in the hospital. I also want to mention that next week, the non-health education series topic is The Cradle of Forestry in America by Robert Beanblossom. Those sessions, non-health education series sessions, are set up by a separate committee, but we do like to kind of co-advertise our events. I think that's all I have to say. David, do we want to take over and introduce our speaker?
Sure. My name is David Mao. I'm part of the Health Education Committee. I work with as one of Ginny's workers. I'd like to mention one business matter before we get going. If you're used to regular Zoom, this is a little different as a webinar. It's not a regular Zoom session. So one of the tricks is that you can't be seen or heard in a webinar. So if you raise your hand or audibly express a question, we're not going to hear it. So how do we get to the questions that turn up in the course of this? You type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you roll your pointer arrow around at the bottom, it'll show up. And then when you click on that, you get a box that you can type in, and those questions will be visible to us. And we're going to, our speaker is going to tackle those either during the talk at intervals or at the end, depending on how many, etc. So it's a great pleasure for me today to introduce to you Marshall Hamar. She comes to us today as a volunteer representing the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And she's a board member of the North Carolina chapter. She's going to talk to us about the tragedy that suicide is for families and etc. when it happens. And it's something she knows firsthand. And she's also going to talk to us about how suicide can be prevented. So it's certainly a relevant topic in the midst of the pandemic when we're all significantly discouraged. Marshall's immensely qualified to speak to us on this topic. Her job is as a master level certified Reiki practitioner with additional certification in animal Reiki. And this past year, she finished a seminary degree from One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York City. She specializes in the healing spirituality of Reiki in helping individuals deal with loss and grief, which this work certainly dovetails well with her suicide prevention interest. 4 years ago, she started a business that you can check out on her website called Reiki for Today, which she has offices in downtown Asheville. The title of her talk today is Talk Saves Lives. Marshall.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited and honored to be doing this talk with you all, and I love the work that you all are doing. I'm going to share my screen. So, on the first slide, suicide can be a sensitive topic to discuss, but talking about suicide is critical to its prevention. And so we're grateful that you have joined us for this important conversation. And I just want to make a couple of notes. One is, if at any point during today's presentation, you feel the need to step away or turn off your camera, please feel free to do so. I want everyone to be able to do whatever they need to take care of themselves around this topic. And on another note, my dog Pryor, he works security here 24 hours a day, and I've encouraged him to clock out. But if someone happens to have the audacity to walk down our public street, then he may start to bark. So I ask for you all to please bear with me. I'll just mute and then unmute again when it is safe.
And actually, they're muted all the time, so.
Well, his bark wouldn't be muted while I'm
I
showing.
see.
Yeah. So just to keep that, at a regular decibel, I'll mute if he begins to bark, but hopefully he won't. Overall, we hope you're able to learn more about suicide prevention from today's presentation and become more comfortable talking about this important issue. Suicide is a complex health issue. Despite its complexity, suicide can be prevented. Just like there are warning signs and risk factors for other health crises, like cardiac arrest, we can learn the warning signs and risk factors that can help us to prevent people from dying by suicide. As with other health issues, prevention can start early, far in advance of the problem, or prevention can occur closer to the time of the crisis. Time can be a critical and life-saving measure. Typically, a life can be saved if you allow time for the person's suicide risk to subside or to get through that period of distress and to get mental health help. To prevent suicide, we need to identify persons who may be suicidal, as well as take an active role in connecting them to help before they take action to end their lives. The purpose of Talk Saves Lives is to provide community members with a general overview about suicide, who it affects, and what can be done to prevent it. This presentation will cover some statistics to give you an idea of the scope of the problem. We will also review some key research findings, including the risk and protective factors that relate to suicide. We will share some information specific to seniors and suicide, and we'll talk about what works and what we can all do to prevent this leading cause of death. How we talk about suicide matters. Before we get started, I want to go over some terminology that is used when we talk about suicide. It's important to model appropriate language so we do not perpetuate the stigma of suicide or mental health conditions. So let's establish a baseline of shared language on this topic. These days, we avoid using the phrase committed suicide, as it can have a negative connotation. Instead, we encourage the phrases died by suicide, ended their life, or killed themselves. When talking about suicide and suicide attempts, we avoid referring to suicide attempts as failed or successful. Not only is it unnecessary, these words imply judgment. Instead, we encourage the use of phrases such as suicide attempt, suicide, and death by suicide. Educating the public about suicide is critical for encouraging folks to seek help, for raising awareness of risk in vulnerable populations, and for advocating for new interventions and prevention strategies for those at risk. When suicide is talked about safely and accurately, we can help reduce the likelihood of its occurrence. We want to change how society understands mental health and suicide, because when we open up and connect, talk really does save lives. All right, so we'll start with the scope of the problem. Suicide is a significant issue that affects individuals, families, and communities worldwide. So let's start with some statistics so we can demonstrate the scope of this problem. Suicide is a global problem. According to the World Health Organization, each year, over 800,000 people die by suicide worldwide. While this is the most accurate data available, we estimate the numbers to be higher since suicide is underreported in many countries. That works out to a suicide every 40 seconds worldwide. In the United States, suicide rates are recorded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. According to the CDC, 47,511 people died by suicide in 2019. This is the most recent data available. This makes suicide the 10th leading cause of death. Suicide takes more lives in the US than homicide, war, and natural disasters combined, or at least before the pandemic. These high numbers are one of many reasons that it's important to talk about suicide like any other cause of death. The more we talk, the less stigmatized the idea that we all face struggles and need support becomes. It's also important to note that for every death by suicide, it's estimated that 25 others attempt. That's about 1 million Americans each year who survive a suicide attempt. When you think about any loss, it impacts many people in the community. Suicide is no different. The loss affects family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, schools, and faith communities. It is estimated that the majority of Americans will experience a suicide loss over the course of their lifetime. I'm just going to make sure that I've got my questions panel up in case. Okay, so no questions yet. So we'll move on to research. Only in the past several decades have scientists been studying suicide. Research is shedding light on many critical areas: what drives up risk and what amounts to effective suicide prevention. And we still have more to learn. This section provides an overview of suicide prevention research, key research findings, and future goals in the field. One of the main questions research explores is, why do people take their own lives? Through research, we have learned that there is no single cause for suicide. Suicide most often occurs when several stressors and health issues converge to create an experience of hopelessness and despair. Research has consistently shown that the large majority of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death. It may or may not have been recognized by the person or their loved ones, may not have been diagnosed or adequately treated. That said, research has also made clear that mental health conditions cannot be the whole story. The vast majority of people who have these health conditions do not die by suicide. In addition to mental health conditions, there are many other factors that increase risk as well. We've learned that the brains of people who die by suicide differ from those who die from other causes in terms of structure and function, specifically in the areas related to stress response and impulse control. We've also learned that most people who are suicidal are ambivalent about taking their life. Part of them wants to live, and part of them wants to die. This research has informed key strategies in suicide prevention that involve engaging the part of the person that wants to stay alive and helping to create distance from the part of them that wants to die. One way we do that is to help the person connect with reasons for living, while at the same time decreasing the visibility and presence of things around them that may facilitate their desire to die. One of the many important things we have learned from research is about the perspective of a suicidal person, that a crisis point has been reached. For a suicidal person, the pain seems unbearable, whether it's emotional pain, physical pain, or sometimes both. For a moment, I'd like you to think back to the most physically painful experience of your life. At that moment, would you have been able to give someone clear and accurate directions to your house? Probably not. The pain makes ordinary thinking nearly impossible. For a suicidal person, thinking becomes constricted at that moment of crisis, a state of intense tunnel vision where other options seem unavailable. Someone who considers suicide cannot foresee a time when that unbearable pain will end. Understanding the perspective of the suicidal person has also helped us to learn that suicidal feelings are often temporary. They can come on intensely and can sometimes pass in minutes or hours. Keeping people safe and helping them feel supported can get them through those critical moments. There is evidence that putting time and distance between an individual who is suicidal and the means to take their life can be a life-saving action. This is why it's so important that we take steps when we know someone is struggling to help keep them safe. All right, I see a question here. Oh, a couple of questions. Okay, the first one is, how do you speak of death with dignity suicides versus other suicides? Examples, folks with serious illnesses that they perceived to be intractable, or those at an advanced age aware that they are entering into a long descent into dementia. Wow, that's a great question. I think there is often a difference in being able to speak on these things, but I think that the way we speak about suicide, some of those guidelines would still apply. But there is certainly this concept, death with dignity, I think is really important as kind of a almost a different category, although it's similar in many ways. I'm gonna hold off on fully being able to answer that question because I think I may have a resource that I'm gonna I can put in the, well, I'm not sure if I can put it in the chat. I can send it to you all though after the presentation, because I have a nice sheet that talking about suicide, and you may find some answers as well along the way in our presentation. And then we have another question. How often are there situations where there are no signs? I recently experienced a loss of a friend by suicide, and he was by all accounts happy, successful, popular among all his friends, and everyone has been completely shocked. How can you help if the pain they're experiencing is hidden? Yeah, that is a really important question. As we go through, there will be some light on this. In fact, especially about being happy, and it's really we'll get more into that, but it's really important to look for any changes in someone's behavior, attitude. And yes, this happens where you don't really see any signs. Sometimes who we are in public among our friends can be quite different than who we are or how we show up when we're alone with ourselves. And it is often shocking when we see Robin Williams, I think was a good example of this. And lots of the celebrities that we've learned about dying by suicide, when we think they must have all the resources available and, you know, the best chance, they're successful, seemingly happy. And it is quite shocking. That's a great question. How can you help if the pain they're experiencing is hidden? And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. Thank you for those questions. Right. Who is at risk? Research has helped determine the key factors that increase the risk for suicide. Risk factors are defined as characteristics or conditions that increase the chance of a person to take their life. Just like someone who is at risk for heart disease because of high blood pressure or a history of heart disease in the family, some people are at higher risk for suicide than others. The main risk factors shown here can be grouped into 3 categories: health factors, historical factors, and environmental factors. These risk factors can converge at different times in life and increase a person's risk for suicidal behavior at particular points in time. Let's look a little closer. The first type of risk factors include health factors, such as biological and psychological medical conditions, the most significant of which are mental health conditions. As we said before, most people who die by suicide have an active mental health problem at the time of their death. Depression is the most common mental health condition and the one that is most associated with suicide. Bipolar disorder is also shown to be high risk, although the disorder is less common than depression. Because these conditions put a person at greater risk for suicide, detecting the presence of a mental health condition is critically important. The best way to be sure when you feel concerned or detect a possible change in you or your loved one's mental health is for the person at risk to seek professional evaluation and effective treatment. Mental health conditions are not the only health factors that are associated with suicide risk. Serious or chronic health conditions can increase risk, especially when the person also has mental health issues. Chronic pain and serious head injuries have also been found to increase suicide risk. The second type of risk factors include historical factors, such as a family history of suicide, a family history of mental health conditions, or past trauma, such as sexual abuse or combat stress. Research has also found that a history of childhood abuse can contribute to suicide risk. And while most people who attempt suicide do not go on to die by suicide, previous suicide attempts are also considered historical risk factors and also put a person at increased risk. The third type of risk factors are environmental factors that involve the circumstances of a person's life. Often, there are aspects of a person's environment that can contribute to their overall level of risk. Let's look at a few of the most common. Having access to a way of killing oneself is referred to as access to lethal means. This includes having access to a variety of things, such as firearms, drugs, a bridge, a car, etc. Research has shown that contagion, the exposure to another person's suicide, or to graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide, especially among those with other risk factors, can increase a person's risk as well. Prolonged stress may include harassment, bullying, relationship problems, legal problems, and unemployment. Stressful life events, which vary across the lifespan, include experiences like divorce, legal problems, or job loss. To better understand suicide risk, here is an example of a set of risk factors that could converge in a person who is suicidal. This example shows what is often the public perception of suicide. When someone dies by suicide, often the story only talks about the environmental factors. People see a life event, like a breakup or bullying or a job loss, and then they see the person die by suicide. So they might assume the person killed themselves because of that stressful life event. But that's never the full story. What others don't know is that the person who died may have had genetic risk for suicide. Maybe they were suffering from depression and anxiety disorders, and their work life had become increasingly stressful. Their underlying depression and anxiety could have made the situation at work even worse, or the work stress could have made their depression worse. Perhaps they'd been drinking more than normal. The key is that the combination of risk factors could have contributed to the suicide death. Therefore, while a life event can play a precipitating role for suicide behavior, without other underlying risk factors, life events alone aren't thought to cause suicide. Looking to the future, research will help us find the best ways to fight suicide. Research is looking for biomarkers. For example, something testable in a blood sample that would help us to identify those at risk. A number of clinical treatments, like particular types of therapy, are effective for suicidal people, and more need to be developed and studied. The good news is that through research, we are learning more and more about what helps those who are in a suicidal crisis. Research can also help us to identify the most effective programs and interventions to reduce suicide rates and to reduce risk in those suffering from mental health conditions. Now, we'll spend a few moments looking specifically at what research has shown us about suicide and suicide risk among a population of special interest, people 65 and over. Although suicide rates are highest among Americans ages 52 to 59, the rate among Americans 65 and older is still higher than the national average. The CDC reports that in 2019, the suicide rate for Americans of all ages was 13.93 per 100,000. For individuals 65 and older, the rate was 16.98 per 100,000, so a little over 3 points higher. When we look at men over 65, their rate is very high, 32.51 per 100,000. A few minutes ago, we saw that in the general population, for each death by suicide, it is estimated that there are 25 attempts. However, when an older adult attempts to end their life, those attempts more often result in death. Some of the reasons for this include things such as isolation, greater access to lethal means, and the increased likelihood of a serious health condition that would make them less likely to survive a life-threatening event. It is also essential to understand that depression is not a natural part of growing older. It is an illness that, if left untreated, can become fatal. You may be asking yourself, what may contribute to a senior's risk? For individuals 65 and older, certain life circumstances can feel like a downpour of stressful events, increasing the risk for suicide. For example, many seniors who live alone have an increased feeling of isolation. They are also more likely to have experienced the loss of a life partner, close friends, or a family member. For many, especially those living alone, losing a pet can be certainly a significant loss as well. Changes in their health can keep them from doing the things they have always done, leading to a loss of independence and making them more reliant on others. Major role changes, such as retiring, can also put older Americans at risk, especially men, who are more likely to define who they are as by their professional career. When these life changes and stresses occur, the things we do to be supportive can make a big difference. Helping the person to stay connected is critical. Reach out to show you're thinking of them and that you care, by phone, online, or in person. Ask how they're doing and genuinely listen. You don't have to have all of the answers or even to fix anything. You just need to be there with them. If their health conditions are limiting their ability to do the things they used to enjoy, try to work together to find some new interests and hobbies that you could potentially do as a team. Most people who experience these changes will not become suicidal, but those with the risk factors we mentioned earlier might. So it's important to stay alert about mental health and stay connected. Right. And now we will get into prevention. Just like there are risk factors that increase a person's risk for suicide, also there are protective factors that lower a person's risk. If you are proactive about mental health and make an effort to get healthier, you protect yourself. More on this in a moment. Feeling connected to family and community support can protect against suicide. When someone is struggling with depression, anxiety, psychosis, or substance abuse, these protective factors that may normally be strong can erode and temporarily weaken. When that happens, having friends and family to remind us of our strengths can be a tremendous protective factor. Problem-solving skills also help. Life can get really tough, but being able to see a way through problems can be a protective factor. Cultural and religious beliefs that encourage connecting and help seeking, and that discourage suicidal behavior or create a strong sense of purpose can also be a protective factor. Because mental health care is so important for preventing suicide, we're going to focus on this topic for the next few minutes. Getting effective treatment for mental health conditions like depression or anxiety can save lives. Critical to suicide prevention is getting people connected to mental health treatment. One of the biggest challenges in fighting suicide is getting people to address their mental health in the same way they would their physical health. In fact, of those suffering from a mental health condition, less than half seek treatment. One way to encourage individuals to seek help for their mental health conditions is to treat mental health like any other aspect of our health. There are certain times when a person becomes ill, and it's critical to see a trained professional. We need a culture where everyone knows it's smart to take care of our mental health. Pardon me just a moment. Okay, I think we've gotten past the walker. Taking care of our mental health is just as important as taking care of our physical health. Seeing a mental health professional is a sign of strength, and many are taking that step. The person seeking help should request a thorough evaluation to figure out if there's a mental health condition affecting their life. There are many types of treatment available, like various kinds of psychotherapy and medications. Research has shown that for many people, the combination of psychotherapy and medications tends to be the most helpful. But the most important thing is to find the treatment that works best for the individual. The good news is that advocacy efforts are improving access to mental health services so that more people can get the treatment they need. The law now requires insurance plans to cover mental health services on par with physical health services. If we need mental health services, and 1 out of 4 of us will at some point, we should get treated and get our health back on track faster. Just like people can find strategies that optimize their physical health, people can do the same for their mental health. In addition to professional mental health care, proactive self-care strategies like good sleep habits, exercise, nutrition, and stress management can also play a critical role in protecting mental health and promoting resilience. Prevention efforts also include support for those touched by suicide. The loss of one person to suicide profoundly impacts many. It is important that survivors have the support they need, both to heal and reduce their own suicide risk. And since those with lived experience, those who have attempted suicide or who experience suicidal thinking, are at increased risk, we need to make sure they have the support they need too. For people who are at a crisis point, the most important thing you can put between a suicidal person and their way of ending their life is time. Research shows that by temporarily reducing a suicidal person's access to lethal means, we give suicidal individuals time. Time for the intense suicidal risk to diminish, and time for someone to intervene with mental health support and resources. For the majority of people who experience a suicidal crisis, if unable to access their chosen method, even temporarily, they are unlikely to engage in another action to end their lives. And that's an incredible finding. In most cases, when a suicidal person doesn't have current access to the means that has been on their mind, they don't substitute with another method. Therefore, a clear way to prevent suicide is to limit access to lethal means. During a period of high risk, the safer their environment is, the better chance a suicidal person has of living through that crisis period. Suicide prevention research has looked at a number of ways to create safer environments. Installing an inexpensive carbon monoxide sensor that would automatically shut cars off if carbon monoxide levels reach unsafe levels would save lives. We've learned through research that installing barriers on bridges deters suicides, and in many cases, bridge barriers actually lowered the suicide rate for the entire region. Restricting access to potentially lethal medications reduces suicides and can be as simple as requiring lethal drugs to be sold in blister packaging. Firearm safety is critical to reducing suicide rates. In the United States, firearms are used in roughly half of all suicides, making suicide prevention an important part of gun safety education. Okay, so now that we've reviewed key suicide prevention efforts, let's talk about what we can all do to help prevent suicide. It's important to have a caring, supportive conversation with someone you might be worried about, to allow them to share what they are experiencing. A conversation is a way to show you care and allows you to gain more information about their level of distress. Let's start by talking about suicide warning signs. Watch for those warning signs in yourself and others. While many of the suicide risk factors we discussed endure over a longer period of time, warning signs are observable signs that signal suicidal risk in the near future. It's important to pay attention to both the risk factors discussed earlier and the warning signs we're talking about now. If you see warning signs, reach out to individuals in your life that you're concerned about, and reach out to others if you're struggling. Seek mental health services if you are depressed or if your anxiety regularly interferes with your daily life, and encourage others to do the same. Suicide warning signs are typically displayed in three main ways that we can detect: talk, behavior, and mood. We'll discuss each of these in more detail. Many people who are suicidal talk about ending their lives. This may be directly or indirectly. A person might say it outright, or they might joke about it. Take it seriously. Some people will say they have no reason to live. Others say things that let you know they may feel trapped or that they feel they are a burden to others. Or they might talk about feeling overwhelmed or being in unbearable pain. Behaviors that are atypical for an individual should also encourage you to speak to the person about what you're noticing. People thinking about suicide can display certain behaviors. There may be an increased use of alcohol or drugs. They may have trouble sleeping, either experiencing insomnia or sleeping too much. They may start acting more recklessly. They might withdraw from activities, especially from those activities that they normally enjoy. They might isolate themselves from family and friends. They also might look for a way to kill themselves, such as searching online for methods or shopping for a firearm. They may also give away their possessions or show a related behavior, like reckless spending. Mood, and this touches upon the second question that was asked about not being able to notice any warning signs and kind of being shocked by the death of someone who seemed happy and successful. People at risk for suicide can display, often quite subtly, any of the following moods: depression, apathy, rage, irritability, impulsivity, humiliation, or anxiety. Moods one would expect of someone who feels overwhelmed and desperate. We all have ups and downs in our mood, but when you notice a change that seems uncharacteristic or concerning, it is important to speak to the person about what you are noticing. For example, sudden unexplained happiness can indicate the individual has decided on a plan and is relieved that they will no longer be in pain. That's really a lot of things to look for. And to sum it up, look for changes in behavior and trust your instincts. Assume you're the only person who is going to reach out. In too many instances, people talked about their concern for someone amongst themselves, but hesitated to reach out to the person directly. So here's a rule of thumb. If you're wondering if someone is depressed or overly anxious, that's a sure sign you should reach out and just talk to them. Same goes for you. If you are having suicidal thoughts, that's also a sure sign you need to seek help. If you have reached out before, reach out again. The first time, the person may not be receptive. Keep trying. Try talking to someone else or with a professional. And even if suicide turns out not to be a concern, they may still be in distress, and they may feel comforted and supported just by knowing you care and that you're taking the time to listen. So how do you reach out to someone? You can talk to them in private, listen to their story, express concern and caring. Ask directly about suicidal thoughts. Do not be afraid to ask the question, are you thinking of ending your life? Encourage them to seek mental health services. If in crisis, take them to help. There are some things to avoid when talking with someone who may be suffering from depression or anxiety. Avoid minimizing their feelings. Those of us who have never experienced major depression literally cannot imagine what it feels like. Avoid trying to convince them life is worth living. If a person is nearing a crisis point, they are not thinking clearly. Philosophical debates about life being worth living tend not to be helpful. Avoid advice to fix it. If a person is having a heart attack, you wouldn't tell them to start exercising or eat a healthier diet. If someone is in crisis, what they need is to be heard and then led to help. Listen to their story and offer to help them find a health professional. Help them take active steps toward keeping their environment safe. If you think they might make an attempt on their life soon, stay with them. Do not leave them alone. However, if the situation puts your own safety at risk, leave the area immediately and call 911. Help them remove lethal means or remove themselves from the potentially dangerous area. Escort them to mental health services or an emergency room. Help them to call the lifeline or call the lifeline yourself, and a trained counselor will tell you what you should do to help the person in distress. If they don't feel comfortable speaking to a counselor on the phone, they can also talk to the crisis text line at 741-741. And if you would, please take out your phones and you can add both of these into your phones as contacts. Even if you never need to use the resources for yourself, you may need them to help a friend. And they're both open 24/7, 365 days a year. I have sent out these numbers like a little contact card, sharing the contact with multiple people over the years. I'll leave that up just for another moment. I just recently saw a post on Facebook where someone had asked the question, what does happen when you call one of these numbers? And someone had answered about their experience in calling a few years ago and having a little bit of a hard time just talking. But then the person on the line with them just spoke to them like an equal, just said, "Hey, what's been going on for you, man?" And they said it really sort of felt like an old friend. So this really does make a difference. And these are great resources for folks. If it's an emergency, such as a suicide attempt in progress, call 911. And this is a side note, but due to the public policy efforts in North Carolina, there is now a number 922 that goes directly to or is soon to be going directly to that Lifeline number. So that's been the work of the Public Policy Committee, which is one that I serve on, and speaking to lawmakers about the research of how to prevent suicides and ask for help in keeping laws that actually help people have resources. And that is also the work of many people just taking a quick survey to say, yes, this would be good, let's do this. So that was one of the victories of 2019. So that's in progress now. Together, we can create a culture that's smart about mental health. We'll save lives and vastly improve the lives of many more. It's a simple yet powerful idea. Talk saves lives. By caring and reaching out, we can all play a part in suicide prevention. And I have a link here to get your feedback. And I'm going to send that. I think this might go to everyone. But if someone can post that into the chat, this is afsp.org/TSL participant. And this is just a feedback form that you can fill out on your phone or computer after we're finished. And we'd love if you provide your insight to help us make this, as well as future training programs, more effective. And I can also email that after the presentation as well to be shared. And you can learn more at afsp.org, or you can follow AFSP National on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I'll just share with you briefly about my personal connection to suicide. This is my dad. I called him Pop, Donald G. Hammer, and he took his life on August 22nd, 2011. He was 61 years old. I had just turned 27. And I have listed here the contributing factors that I'm aware of, as there may be more that I'll never know. Like we've talked about in this presentation, these days it's hard to find a person who doesn't at least know someone who knows someone who died by suicide. AFSP regards suicide as a public health crisis, and that these kinds of deaths are about much more than just the individual who decided to take their life. One of the most difficult things I've found about losing a loved one to suicide is how often in public perception, their life seems to suddenly be defined by the way that they died. These deaths often become sensationalized. And I think over time that changes usually. My best way to combat this is to tell the story of my father as the man he was when he was alive. And my loved ones remember him that way. Losing my father has been definitely the hardest thing I've ever endured. For our family, I think our risk of suicide has actually decreased because of going through this experience. A decade later, my life looks completely different. My path changed completely. I became committed to knowing myself and learning to care for myself better, knowing that my life may very well depend on it. I moved out of the service industry and into a one-on-one helping field about a year after my dad died, and found Reiki and a 12-step fellowship, adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families. And as David said, I recently completed a 2-year interfaith, interspiritual seminary program. Today, I get to work with people and animals through Reiki and through a monthly survivors group for people that have lost loved ones to suicide. And my ministry is sort of budding now. I'm grateful, on one hand, to know grief like this, because it's helped me to be more able to listen very deeply and compassionately. And the love I have for my fellow person has grown even more. Through serving on the NC chapter board of AFSP, through facilitating monthly support groups for those grieving, and through giving talks like this one, I have managed to give my pain purpose. I like to imagine a world where suicides are not only prevented, but where we are able to talk about our needs and struggles openly, without shame or embarrassment. We all suffer, and through compassionate connection with others, I believe we improve the lives of everyone, including ourselves. Thank you all for listening. It has been an honor to be with you today. And thank you for choosing to be here too. If we have more questions, I'm gonna stick around. I can tell you about our local chapter, our current initiatives, and how you can get involved. And again, thank you so much for being here. Together we can save lives.
Well, Marshall, that was a wonderful talk. It was very informative and very honest and practical. I learned a lot. It got me thinking about a lot of things and how I was managing my own risk factors for suicide and those around me. So it's information that's super helpful to all of us as we age and look at the end of our lives, which is one of the big jobs we have to deal with at OLLI, because we go in full of energy and capability and wellness, and when we finish up 10 or 15, 20 years later, we've had to deal with a lot of things that are pretty discouraging in our own lives and the people we know. So it's a really relevant topic for us, and you dealt with it honestly and practically. I really appreciate it. So
thank you. We're very early, right? That was a short presentation for the time, but I appreciate you all inviting me to do this. This is such a, it seems odd to say I love to talk about suicide and suicide prevention, but it's so important and not talked about. So thank you.
Our crowd was small, but I'm sure each one got a lot out of it, and you don't need a big crowd to accomplish something when you're doing it like you've done it. And I'm sure you experience that every day in your daily work and Reiki as well.
Just the one-on-one talking really makes a difference.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, if our anonymous attendee who asked this question, how can you help if the pain they're experiencing is hidden? I just wanted to say that I'm very sorry for your loss. And this is, I think it's really, really courageous that you were here today to hear about this and to educate yourself, because it's something, these losses are they're really world shattering, world view shattering. And so I'm glad that you were here, and I am very sorry.
I always, in my life, I've many times thought about the quote, "The world is so full of a number of things. I think we should all be as happy as kings." But the fact is, the world has a lot of tough stuff in it. And everybody, by the time they go through life and negotiate death and dying, there's a lot of tough spots and a lot of reasons for people to have suicidal thoughts. I expect everybody has suicidal thoughts at one point or another.
Hmm.
I'd be surprised if there are people that never think of it. We had another comment entered in the Q&A from Ginny Felice. She says, "Wow, Marshall, I had no idea you lost your father to suicide. Thank you for sharing such a compassionate talk."
Well, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, it's been a really interesting decade since losing him. But you know, even though they're my family, there's been so much pain and grief. There have been some bright spots, and I still feel him around, you know, often. And when I hear, especially when I hear a really corny joke, I always think, oh, that my dad would love that, and just think he must be enjoying it too.
And my father died about 30 years ago. He got married at an older age. And anyway, I was very close to him. We did a lot of hiking and camping, especially canoeing and visiting the boundary waters in Canada and northern Minnesota. And anyway, we did a lot together. And for years after he died, and even now, I get the feeling that he's there often. You know, I have an experience, I do something, and I think my dad would have enjoyed that, or that's something I'm doing because my dad did it, or this little mannerism or thing that I do comes directly from my dad, just sort of wired in. So, and he got some fairly significantly demented the last year or so of his life. And I'm sure he was ready to die. And I'm sure if he'd had a chance to conveniently commit suicide, he'd have done it, just
Mm.
because he hated being so diminished. But life is hard.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of my dad's depression, because he had had a couple of surgeries that, you know, when I was a kid, he played tennis twice a week, racquetball once a week. He played bridge. He was very sharp-minded and really lived, I think, through his mind. But that he was athletic, you know, and when he wasn't really able to do those things, I mean, like we've learned, exercise and good sleep has a lot to do with our mental health, and I think those were both diminished for him. It's like his world became a lot smaller, you know.
Yep.
But I do love that, what you're saying about, you know, this is how we honor our loved ones through our lives. I
Yep.
mean, that's a really beautiful concept.
We have one more question in the Q&A box.
Oh, thank you. So, someone who has a dear friend who lost his wife to suicide, and that person will share this information with him, and to make sure that um, the friend gets that, so that his family has a way to like help his children who may be at risk. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, part of this presentation, I mean, it's no coincidence it's called Talk Saves Lives, but um, you know, we learn research and statistics and ways of prevention, but the number one way is just talking to people one-on-one if you're concerned, but also just opening up the discussion to be able to talk about suicide more openly, not as a shameful thing. And I think that that's why we're moving away from that language, committed suicide, because committed can imply either like sort of a criminal behavior, like someone who commits a crime, or
Yeah.
there's a bit of like sort of biblical judgment on it. So I'm glad to see that that's starting to change, although it's hard to get out of the habit because that's just how we've talked about it for all this time.
There's another question in the Q&A as well after that one.
I see. Do you distinguish between people taking their lives after contemplation and a calm, conscious decision, for example, to end the pain of terminal cancer, and those who act in what looks to an outsider as impulsive? That's a great question. I think that goes along with the first question today about the difference of death with dignity suicides versus other suicides. I mean, my answer is I do distinguish those as two separate things, because I think after careful contemplation, and it's likely that a person who makes the decision in that calm, conscious manner, like you mentioned, it's likely that that person would be working with a health professional as well, or I would hope so, because that would be something that hopefully people, I think people have access to, you know, those sort of services to help, just to help, like we would come up with a nutrition plan or an exercise plan. That would certainly be something to discuss with a professional mental health counselor or doctor. So yeah, I do definitely think there's a difference. And what we've talked about today in risk behaviors of suicide, often it can be like almost like a perfect storm of mental health, an underlying mental health condition. There may be historical or other health factors as well, and that feeling of hopelessness, that feeling of being a burden to others, and when three or more of those come together, it can often create this experience where the risk is high or imminent. And that's, that's very different, I think, than the scenario that you're asking about. Oh, here's another one. How do you speak with a friend who is rationally contemplating ending their life? I wonder, I mean, I think that one great thing to talk with that friend about is, or to really just to be a source of listening. Sometimes I always say we've had enough advice for multiple lifetimes, each of us. And I think that often we will try to, like that slide that was about debating whether life is worth living. Sometimes it's good when someone's going through a difficult time and considering this scenario, to just say to them, as you're hearing, yeah, that sucks. That sounds painful. That sounds bad, instead of saying, oh no, it's actually this other way. And so I think if you're concerned about your friend ending their life, you could get them in touch with help and resources in the area. Counselor, the Lifeline number, and AFSP also has on their main page, they have different sections, and one is I'm concerned about a friend, and they have a lot of resources there as well on how to approach that situation. Certainly it would be good to let someone know. Yeah, it's a very tricky thing because whatever our beliefs are, aside from that, we certainly want to prevent death, in these ways as much as we can, and feeling, because life is hard, and we can be compassionate toward the struggles that someone is going through, and also still try to help, not help a person not end up on that path that's such a permanent ending. We don't want just to decrease and prevent suicide. We want people to be able to live lives that feel good, I'm
And I
not
think
sure.
that's one of the really hard things about dementia, because people are often aware that they're sliding into it, and they're saying to themselves, I don't want to follow this through to the conclusion that I've seen in other people as the dementia gets worse and worse. And yet, as they get worse and worse, they lose the ability to make decisions about living and dying. So it requires a lot of advanced planning and people that care about you and can make decisions on your behalf when you're too demented to make them for yourself. And that's a really tricky one.
Absolutely. And we actually, when my dad died, we asked if people were going to do something instead of flowers to donate to the Alzheimer's Association, because we felt that when he had injured his head, that might have onset dementia for him. And, all their research, I mean, they've done so much, but we really need more in the way of helping to prevent dementia and treat it,
Well, if there are no other questions, you've been very gracious about hanging around to answer these extra ones. That was good. That was a bonus to have those questions come in here at the end. So
Yeah, that's great. There is the question, why do we want to prevent death when the person has a rational reason to end their life? I would say, to answer that, my best answer is that I think the goal would really be to make sure the person has resources and is engaged with their friends, family, that they feel cared for, and connected as much as possible, and that they're able to speak to someone and be in connection with someone who is a professional. So it may not be that we would want to, I think it's less about preventing death as encouraging life and assistance resources for getting through. They keep popping up. Thank you. I hope that made sense. I'm better when I have typed out the words. So I don't know how articulate I've been in the Q&A section, but yeah, I do think that would be, certainly we want death as the last resort, the very last option. If there are other options and other support, that would be the goal. All right. Well, thank
all
you.
right, thanks again very much for a wonderfully meaningful talk and for staying around to deal with these questions. And Jacqueline, I think we're ready to close it out.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
again, Marshall.
Good to see you.